Welcome everyone to Monona Terrace's Wright Design Series, Zoom edition. My name is Misty Lorenz. I'm the Community Events Coordinator at Monona Terrace. Our presenter today is Heather Sabin, Monona Terrace's Tourism Coordinator. She has managed Monona Terrace's tours, volunteers, and educational activities for the past 19 years. She received her Master's of Arts in Teaching in Museum Education from George Washington University and worked previously at Chicago Botanic Garden, Rock County Historical Society, and Taliesin. Heather creates STEAM programs for K through 12 scouts and families, as well as an architecture and design lecture and film series. Please welcome Heather Sabin.
Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to be with you today. You have seen me as the host of these Zoom lectures in the past, and we thought, well, we're closed to the public for the foreseeable future. Why not do a Wright Design series about our own building, Monona Terrace? And I look forward to sharing this with you today. I uncovered this Frank Lloyd Wright quote, "The belief in a thing makes it happen." I don't know the context of the quote, and I certainly can't say that his reference is to Monona Terrace, but it seemed like a perfect title for us. And my colleague who works in social media said, you know, we need to be clear with people this is about Monona Terrace when we post it on Facebook and such. So we landed on "The belief in a thing makes it happen, the Monona Terrace story." I said to my colleague, this sounds like an 80s TV movie. Perhaps you all remember Poor Little Rich Girl, the Barbara Hutton story. And then I thought, that's probably pretty appropriate, because the story of Monona Terrace is one of twists and turns. There's some love, there's some hate, there's a roller coaster ride of a 60-year project. So why not? This seems like a good title. So from the outset, we should say that Frank Lloyd Wright worked on Monona Terrace for 21 years, designing the project from 1938 to 1959. There were 8 main iterations of the design, and he was paid $250. The question is why? And that's something we hope to answer today. This project was truly a labor of love for the hometown of Madison. And so what makes sense right off the bat is to communicate some of his formative experiences as a boy in Madison. You may know that a young Frank would have moved around a bit with his parents and 2 younger sisters in the early part of his life, but eventually they landed in Madison when Wright was age 10, and that's the photograph you see on the left that we think was taken when he was about 10 years old. His boyhood memories of Madison were very fond. He recalled working with friends on producing newspapers with a printing press. He recalls ice boating on the lakes in Madison, and there's a drawing there that captures that idea. That is the state capitol dome in the background. And it certainly must be said that even though this is not a place-based experience, in that it didn't only happen in Madison, that the Freuble blocks he received from his mother at age 9 were extremely influential on his thinking about geometry underlying all forms around him, that in both nature and the built environment, shapes were everywhere. It was also experiences in rural areas of Wisconsin, and particularly the Spring Green area, what we know as the Wyoming Valley, that were certainly influential in Wright's development. He would spend his school year in Madison, but summers he would be shipped off to his mother's ancestors. They were the Lloyd Joneses. They were from Wales and had come to Wisconsin in search of religious freedom. Fierce Unitarians. Their family motto, truth against the world. There were also a couple of kind of events in Wright's time in Madison that we should point out. On the left is a photograph showing a construction accident at the Wisconsin State Capitol in 1883. This would not be the current building that stands, but the previous, where there was an expansion taking place. And Wright was attending high school just a couple of blocks from the Capitol. There was a lot of noise, people rushed to the scene, and there had been an accident due to what was believed to be poor workmanship and materials. And you can see there a collapse that killed 8 people. Wright recalls in his autobiography that he saw men running from the site, falling to their deaths, and in fact being pinned by materials. So quite gruesome. And this stuck with him. Another more positive experience was his work with a gentleman named Alan Conover. Alan Conover was a civil engineer and became a professor of engineering at UW-Madison. It was under Conover's employment that Frank Lloyd Wright, a young Frank Lloyd Wright, was encouraged by Conover to attend UW-Madison's engineering program. He did so for less than 2 semesters, but nonetheless, during this time, he would have been observing Conover's design of the Science Hall building on UW's campus. We don't know if Wright had any architectural contributions to that building. We do know that he talks about climbing some steel trusses to the roof to replace a part. That's the extent to what we know. But certainly we need to mention, of course, his short time at the UW and what was a meaningful experience with the professor there, Alan Conover. Now, this is not a presentation about Taliesin, of course, but we cannot certainly omit that Wright had built Taliesin in 1911, and that was in fact his home base until his death in 1959. Of course, later splitting his time between Taliesin and Taliesin West in Arizona. But this was his home and studio for over 40 years. And it was the place where he invited his clients to come and meet and discuss projects. Taliesin, as you may know, is an amazing place to visit, open to the public this summer. And Wright chose a Welsh word to name it, of course, in honor of his maternal ancestors. The Welsh name means shining brow, and here's the best photo I've found to illustrate the concept with, if you were to imagine standing on the top of the hill in the bottom right corner of the photograph, you would see the house wrap around you, shining brow, the brow of the hill. The studio is the structure to the left, and the living quarters are sort of center and to the right of the screen. And it's important noting that Madison was the closest city to Taliesin, about 45 minutes away. So it was necessary for Wright to go to Madison frequently to conduct business, to meet with clients if necessary, to acquire services and supplies. So his home base was near his boyhood home. So Wright began accepting commissions in Madison in 1893. Here are a few examples of built Wright projects. And these would have happened in the first couple of decades of his practice. The Lake Mendota Boathouse, the only boathouse designed for Madison that was constructed and unfortunately razed in 1926. But an early project for Wright. We also see the Gilmore House of 1908 and the Lamp House of 1903. Both of these are early projects for Wright, and the Gilmore is really considered the truest prairie-style home in Madison. Wright was already working in Madison and would go on to later design 8 residences for Madison, and of course, additionally, the Unitarian Meeting House. He was a member of that congregation. And it's also important in placing Monona Terrace in the context of Wright's work to note all that was going on for Wright in the late 30s when he began to work on Monona Terrace. So this was not a project he needed to take. It was a project that he wanted to take. He was very busy at the time. His career saw a renaissance in the late 1930s with huge projects that put him back on everyone's radar, including, of course, Falling Water near Pittsburgh, the Johnson Wax buildings in Racine, Wisconsin, and another Madison residence, Jacobs 1, which is considered very important in Wright's career in that it's considered the first built Usonian project that he worked on. In 1938, he was on the cover of Time magazine, and it's in 1938 when he begins to work on Monona Terrace. So let's take a look at the site that would eventually accommodate the building. This is a 1908 bird's eye view of Madison, and it's a great perspective. Take the feature dominated the landscape. We have a strip of land in Isthmus that is surrounded by two lakes. We have Lake Mendota in the background and Lake Monona in the foreground. We have the Wisconsin State Capitol, of course, here in the center. And roughly the equivalent of 3 city blocks to the lakeshore of Monona. And it is right here that we're going to see the building being imagined for that site. Now, in our origin story of Monona Terrace, there's one person who must be mentioned. Without him, the structure would never have happened at all 60 years later. That person is Paul Harloff. Paul was a local electrician turned real estate developer. He was sort of active in local issues and was keeping an eye on the development of this lakefront site. He imagined it would be a beautiful place for what the city needed, an auditorium and government offices. The story goes that he and Wright met sometime in the mid-30s. Right here, you see a small green lawn at the bottom center of your screen. That is a park called Olin Terrace. And it said the two met at night, and Paul Harloff was extremely persuasive in meeting with Frank Lloyd Wright in presenting him the site and saying, could you possibly design a civic auditorium for this site? It was a discussion that Madisonians were having at the time. And Wright said he was rather moved by it. He said the possibilities of the site were clear to him. So it was there that the conversation began in 1938. Some time passes, but it is the year of 38 when the project takes hold of city conversations, and Paul Harloff says that he has some kind of sketchy communication with Wright at first, on again, off again, and then he reads in the newspaper that Wright has presented some sketches to the Lions Club. So it sort of took off without Paul even realizing it. And here's an early concept of Monona Terrace. What we see here is that Wright is already thinking about a semicircular design and symmetry and two projecting cylindrical forms, if you will, here and here. What this doesn't show is that other drawings do is sort of an axial relationship to the state capitol. And make no mistake about it, it's the state capitol dome that has everything to do with Wright's choice of the circular form in this case. He also did some scribbling kind of interestingly at the top of the drawing, and he wrote some names down here of people he needed to talk to, political figures, and in a couple of cases here, editors of local newspapers, people he thought he needed to check in with and sort of vet the project. So also working off of that same 1938 iteration, he is now presenting a plan in more detail, which shows you quite a combination of functions for the building. It shows you court spaces, it shows an auditorium in the center there. It doesn't read very well on this slide, but there are jail cells incorporated into the plan. And interestingly, if you were jailed here, you would have a view of the lake. There are a couple of things also that remain constant, and that is that there's a rooftop garden, and there's also a drive around the perimeter of the building on the lake shore. And I think that's interesting. Those of you who are Wright fans know that he had several projects that incorporated drives for automobiles. And so this was definitely one of them. Also worth mentioning is that a train station would occupy space here as well. It was, the site was very close to a railroad. I apologize that this isn't a better image for you to see, but here we get the perspective from the lake, again 38, which shows a lakefront drive here. You see the Capitol Dome in the background. You also see that the rooftop terrace would happen here, and here's a band of windows enclosing about 3 stories of space. But what's phenomenal is that Wright had worked on fountains for the rooftop garden, which would cycle lake water. And in fact, it would deposit water back to the lake via these waterfalls. And this is really the best one you can see here. About the middle of your screen, there's a little bit of a blot that indicates a waterfall. There would have been one directly opposite on the other side. So quite spectacular. And here is the rooftop drawing. So here are the fountains that I just mentioned, and those were designed to be absolutely stunning. They were glass domes, again, meant to directly call back to the state capitol dome. And Wright really had fun with the interpretation of these domes. For instance, you may know the state capitol dome has a gilded sculpture at the very top. Wright intended for these glass domes to be placed at critical points on the roof where inside sculpture would be displayed. So in fact, you could see the sculpture inside the building when you're up on the roof looking through the glass, but also there were a couple other things happening. They were lit from inside and also water pumped over them. So there's a lot going on here, but it really was quite exciting to think about in terms of a rooftop garden. You see already too that he started to think about pole lighting for the perimeter of that garden, some landscaped areas in green, and then you would have a walkway here that would connect you to the sidewalk to the Capitol. So the discussion that begins in 38 is thwarted by numerous political obstacles, but really it was World War II that halted Monona Terrace for a few years. Obviously, everyone's attention was somewhere else, and frankly, Wright would not be successful in advancing the discussion in the late 40s after the war ended, or even until, even in the early 50s, until 1953. And 53 is when we see the conversation once again become lively in Madison around a civic auditorium. The focus was less on government space and jails, more on the public performance space of a civic auditorium. And the next few slides show Wright sort of retooling the designs for the 50s. Now, there was a 1954 referendum. If you had been in Madison at that time, you would have voted on three things. Do we build this building for $4 million? Do we put it at the proposed site on the lakeshore? And here's the best one, is Frank Lloyd Wright the architect? And all three of those passed in 1954, with 52% notably voting yes on the Frank Lloyd Wright question. This, of course, stroked his ego and made him very happy that the people of Madison were giving him this positive feedback. Now you can see here that this is a little bit different from 38. And, you know, once again, we have these domes that are rising out of the rooftop garden. There are fewer of them now, there are three. He called them Sun, Moon, and Earth. And we notice in the 50s that they start to look more like colored glass, less like translucent glass. But perhaps the most kind of surprising feature of this particular design is not just a drive around the lake, but you actually see here cars parked on these rings. So Wright was addressing Madison's downtown parking shortage by adding some space for what he thought would be thousands of parking spaces. And it's quite hard to imagine now that you would go into this building and look out and see cars rather than the lake, but he is trying to meet the needs of the city to push the project forward. And I would just take a second to say, we don't think of Frank Lloyd Wright as flexible, but in the case of 21 years of Monona Terrace designs, we see him, you know, sometimes rather unhappy that he needs to make changes. In his letters to the mayor, we sense that he's grumbling a little bit, but really being quite responsive to the needs of the cities to make it a more politically viable project. And here is the rooftop design for the 53 concept. 53 to 55 is what this cluster of slides are showing you. It looks quite a bit like the 1930s 38 concept. Again, 3 domes, fewer domes, but certainly colored. The drawing is colored to make it quite dramatic and to show you the scale. Now I want to give you a sense of the size of this project. It would take up about 1,000 feet of lakeshore frontage, and it goes out about 485 feet into the water. So it's scaled to be quite massive, and I think the little human figures here probably indicate that to you. This is the stunner of the drawings of that time period. This was done by an apprentice in Wright Studio, Alan Davison, who created this beautiful nighttime rendering of the roof. Here you really see how this looks like a flying saucer has landed. You can get a sense of the lit sun, moon, and earth fountains. The cars are indicated by the small white lights on the roof. Beautiful landscaping and a drive around the lakeshore. So through the 50s, we see some changes as the civic leaders, both in Madison and on the county level, are working to force Wright within a $4 million budget, which is no small feat. Wright wanted to spend about 17. There were also other factors at play. And besides the budget, one thing that really forced him to scale this project down was the dock line law, state law, which indicated you could not fill beyond a certain point. So we go from about 485 feet into the water to a little over 300 feet into the water. And here is a scaled down version, which Wright drew just a few weeks before he passed away in April of 1959. You can see that this does not only look different in terms of size perhaps, but also just in the window detail here, going to more of an arched window design. Prominent cylinders on each side. We still have the 3 fountains on the roof, but quite a few changes made to be able to scale to meet that dock line law and to meet the budget. So the controversy around Monona Terrace is complicated, and it depends on the time period that you are talking about. So I thought I would just put on the screens some of the issues that were coming to the forefront. You have Frank Lloyd Wright, who has, in his autobiography, praised Madison, but also said that Madisonians are educated, and I'm quoting, far beyond their capacity. So there's a love-hate relationship going on. He's also very critical of what Madison builds. He talks about structures that turn their backs on the lake. He, in fact, goes to the steps of a recent government building that was put up just a block or so from the Monona Terrace site, and he says, "Nice cereal box you have here." He also talks about the vision, and he always felt that the city was holding him back and that he was encouraging them to think big. He wanted the structure to be a mega structure that accommodated many purposes and needs. And he says this is an idea that would raise Madison from the ranks of mediocrity. So not just the scope of the project, but also let's do something that puts us on the map. As I mentioned, he thinks the project would cost no less than $17 million. We all know he had a hard time sticking to budget. And I like this quote. He says, "I'm just an old fool who would like to make a final contribution to my boyhood town." So it is this push and pull for Frank Lloyd Wright of, I love Madison, it's my home, but they have never before now given me a grand civic project. Here's my chance, and I have the chance to make something special for you. Let me do it. Meanwhile, you have citizenry and mayors changing officials, county supervisors. You have more clients than Wright has ever before dealt with, and everybody's got an opinion, of course. Throughout time, we have seen some of the arguments against Monona Terrace to be Wright's design doesn't meet all of the city's needs. The design would block the lake view, and here I would point you to look at the John Nolan's 1909 plan for Madison. John Nolan was hired by the city of Madison to come and do some city planning for Madison. He did a fantastic rendering of the Monona Terrace site before, of course, it was the Monona Terrace site in 1909, and its terraces, outdoor spaces, band shelters. I raised this because Madisonians remember that plan. It was never executed, but they loved the green space, and they loved the fact that you could look down from the state capitol and see the lake. The Monona Terrace design would perhaps allow you to do that from the elevated slope of the capitol. But as you move down towards the site, you would lose the view of the lake. And people didn't love that. I mention again that Madisonians were put off sometimes by Wright's personality and insulting, of course. They wanted to stick to that $4 million structure. And here we have a couple of quotes from key opponents to the project. This gives you a sense of the vitriol here. "I thoroughly detested Wright as a man and hated him as an American citizen," Joe Jackson. "Wright was always wrong," says Carol Metzner, a state assemblyman. And you will hear Carol's name come up shortly. In fact, you'll hear his name come up right now. Though everything seems to be moving in a direction of positive momentum in the 50s, in 1957, the project was dealt a serious blow. Carol Metzner, this assemblyman I just mentioned, was able to get a bill passed through the state legislature that prohibited building on the Monona Terrace site or any lakeshore site higher than 20 feet. And that bill was intended to kill the project. It did, for about 2 years. The bill was repealed, and Monona Terrace was back on everyone's radar. Wright passes away just a couple months after. So the timing is really unfortunate. The bill was in effect 2 years. Those years go by, and then we lose Frank Lloyd Wright. And there it is. It's important for me to mention the successor firm when Frank Lloyd Wright dies, Taliesin Architects, under the leadership of William Wesley Peters, who makes some traction in moving the project to discussion in the 60s, but it just doesn't happen. And it really isn't until the 1980s that we see Anthony Putnam, went by Tony, come into the picture. I am unhappy to say that we lost Tony in 2017. He was a wonderful person and very passionate about this project. Believe it or not, Tony had worked on the Monona Terrace model 3 decades before, in the 50s. And here he is now a working architect in Madison. He is approached by the city's mayor, Paul Soglin, with a very specific task. His task was this: is it feasible that we could not change Frank Lloyd Wright's exterior design, but adapt the interior for a convention center? So it was clear that everybody wanted Frank Lloyd Wright's exterior designs, but knew that the insides, the guts, must be modified, because Wright designed, of course, an auditorium, and Tony is coming in to look at a convention center plan. So that is the question put to Tony, who goes to work and determines, yes, this can be done. And fast forward a few years later, a referendum in 1992, voting yes, narrowly, but yes, for the project. In 1994, construction beginning, and the building opening in 1997. Of course, now we have all this wonderful drone photography. So we have this lovely aerial shot of the project that shows a concert, I think, happening there on the roof. And as you can see, the relationship again to the Capitol and the surrounding buildings there. So the project opened its doors. Actually, just our anniversary was just a few days ago in 1997. So we will be celebrating our 25th anniversary soon. The project was built for $67 million, and money came from the city, the county, the state built the parking lot and continues to own and run it, and private donations of $8 million. Let's take a look at some the two images next to each other. At the top, Wright's last drawing of Monona Terrace. At the bottom, a photo of the building that we have. And you can see that Tony stayed quite true to the exteriors whenever possible. You see the 7 arching windows, the 2 cylinder forms flanking each side. You see a rooftop garden. You see spiraling helix parking ramps, sort of ramps to go into our parking lot. This building was built on the same site that Wright had designed for, and the building is within 6 inches of Wright's 1959 design. It is a little bit larger in square footage to accommodate convention center needs by about 100 and some thousand square feet. I'm going to take us back to this image. Now imagine you're standing here. This is what we call Olin Terrace, the walkway that connects to the street. And then one would approach as a pedestrian this way and walk into the building over here. Imagine you're standing here now to view both the Capitol and the terrace. In one direction, the state Capitol here. Here is the approach to the pedestrian entrance of Monona Terrace. And immediately what you would notice is the curvilinear concrete surfaces of the terrace, both concrete and, I should say, a curved entry of glass. This is, again, a very strong reference and connection to the Capitol Dome and the circle base of that feature. He has kind of played with the saucer form that Frank Lloyd Wright has, and later Tony, sort of a dome turned upside down, if you will. And you can see even the water spray of the fountain is a dome spray to convey that. And perhaps what is most unusual about our design, at least if you visit other Wright buildings, it's not often you hear about symmetry. And here it was very deliberate that Wright and then later Tony would create a symmetrical design to respond to and connect to the Capitol. What you don't see in the photograph to the left are that there are two ramps, one on either side, that take you up as a pedestrian to the rooftop garden, and they very much echo the two wings that you see extending out from the Capitol here. So now I'd like to take you on a little mini tour of our current building. And we must say at this point that though Putnam was intent upon preserving the exteriors of the building, that Wright's program was different as an auditorium, and he had not gotten along in the design process, if you will, to have specifications about furnishings, paints, interior details. That was not something that Tony worked with. Tony was working quite successfully, I think, as an organic architect trained by Wright, and made some similar choices, I think, that Wright would have made. He was very interested in the dome skylight, but could not really rely upon Wright's concepts, which were more, well, I will say they were operating as fountains and more fantastical. What Putnam opted to do is to create two dome skylights at either end of our building. And here's the most dramatic one. This skylight is sort of capping a rotunda space, you will, of about 2 floors. And the beauty of this is in the shape, in the natural light. And of course, some people remark that it's sort of a mini Guggenheim effect. We'd like to be put in that company, so we'll take that. And what Tony also set out to do was to follow in Wright's footsteps of geometry and grammar, the idea that a space is repeated, or excuse me, a shape is repeated in 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional details. So one would come down a flight of stairs from the pedestrian entrance, or if you came by car, you would be walking right through those doors on the right side of the screen, and you would encounter this entrance, which shows to you that beautiful curved line in many different details, whether it be the curving arcs of the ceiling, the carpet design there at the entrance, planters, signage, the desk that is a little far off in the distance there, probably hard to tell that's a sort of circular desk, but it is. And this lighting motif that Wright had played with on the rooftop, Tony brings inside. And so we have this pole and saucer working at several points throughout the building. Now, if you were looking straight past the main entrance I just showed you and ahead of you down this hallway we call the Capitol Promenade, you would be in fact getting this little tease of a view ahead of you. And you'd be drawn to it, of course. You can tell that it's there's some daylight there. So one typically wants to walk down this hallway. You see a dropped ceiling at the entrance to that space. and you would move through it to go into the room. And this is the space that is called the Grand Terrace. So you would come into the room under the low ceiling, and you would experience an opening of the space, an expansion, this compression release idea that Wright is known for. Our ceilings do meet building code. They're typically a little over 8 feet tall, so that compression sense isn't quite the 6-foot intensity of going to Taliesin, for instance, but nonetheless, it's notable. It's a lowered ceiling plane that then opens into this space. And of course, the other key element here is the dramatic view of the lake. So Wright's design inspirations not only include the state capitol borrowed from the urban environment, but also the beauty of the natural landscape. It's a really terrific site incorporating both natural and urban. And here we have a rather panoramic view. The curved wall that you see here with the 7 windows that Wright specified really enables you to get a tremendous view that is not cut off at either end if you had made the space rectangular, of course. You see the shoreline from one end to the other. It was important to Putnam to incorporate into the program of the building a small theater space. Wright had maintained that throughout the designs for Monona Terrace. He had included a small theater room. We call this our lecture hall, and it is a very popular space for our clients who want top of the line audio visual for presentation. Seats about 300 people. You see here again the saucer light pole used in the lecture hall on the stage. And I'll also point out the lectern. There was another person brought into the design process in the 90s, also trained by Taliesin. His name is Aubrey Banks. And Aubrey's specific job was to design some of the furnishings for rooms. And this lectern is just an elegant piece made of cherry wood. We've of course got a bunch of them that go into various rooms as we serve our convention center needs. And they are quite lovely additions to the space. One of Tony's great challenges was sort of reconciling what he had learned in his training as an organic architect, that he wanted to keep interiors open and flowing, and the fact that a convention center by its very nature sort of it keeps people enclosed in spaces, that people want privacy, they've paid for a room, that is their space. But he was clever about reconciling that. And I do reference breaking the box when I give a tour of Monona Terrace here, because I think the glass wall does meet the client's needs, and it's a tremendous view through the room and out the other side to the lake. So we are not shut out from that view in the hallway. It's all very airy and transparent and light, as you see here, and a very popular room with our clients. Here is another view inside of the room where you can see, again, the glass enclosed wall, interior wall, and then the wall facing the lakefront. This is called our community terrace. One of the things Tony needed to accomplish in his program for the building was rooms of different sizes for different sized groups, of course, and we do have a couple of rooms that are boardrooms. This is one of them. It's a lovely space that seats about 14 comfortably. And what I like to point out here is the table. This is, again, the work of Aubrey Banks. The table is the shape of the room. So it's a sort of like a segment of an orange is how I refer to it sometimes with kids. It's a semicircular shape, almond shape, and here is the table that has been designed to fit it perfectly. And again, made of cherry wood. It's a wonderful addition to the building. But the carpet, and the carpet has been really something throughout the history of our building, because it's bright when you walk into the building. This is our third carpet in 22 years because we replace it every 7 years. It's due to the wear and tear of having thousands of people come in and use the building every year. So imagine that the carpet was actually more this color in the field of the carpet, this orange, in the first 2 runs of carpet, and people's minds were blown that they walked into the building and there was this bright carpeting. Well, Tony had a reason for choosing warm colors. He called them all autumnal. You've probably noticed in past slides that the wall color is very neutral. It's kind of a tan, similar to what Wright would have chosen. And the lake view is usually blue, or actually white or gray a lot during the winter, cool colors. So he wanted energizing colors. He chose these particular colors for that reason. And the design, he says, was based on a ginkgo leaf. So again, capturing this abstraction of nature, he's following in Wright's footsteps that way. And I've actually seen some tours of Wright homes virtually recently, because there's a lot of that going on. And I've seen some bright color schemes in other Wright buildings. I'm not going to rule it out as completely not right. No pun intended, or pun intended. To show you a more utilitarian space in the building, this is the exhibit hall. And it's again, not an architecturally interesting space necessarily, but you do see that the ceiling structure is radial and carries through that curved line design. And also the concrete floor was colored to be kind of a red-orange. I am not going to go so far as to say Cherokee red, but something that is close to it. Though Wright is known for his cantilever terraces, it's very important to say that we are not cantilevered over the lake, that in fact, we drove 1,725 pilings into the bedrock of Lake Monona and are supported in that way. So here is the process by which that happened in late 94 through 1995. I imagine we had a lot of neighbors mad at us through that period, but it did accomplish setting steel pillars in through the lake, hitting bedrock, and then of course enclosing underwater an ice wall as well to help prevent the force of ice doing any damage structurally. And as we approach from the water now, I just want to take a few slides to look at the relationship of the building to the lake. You do see here that it's a wonderful shot that shows the dome of the Capitol kind of popping up over over Monona Terrace. And that you have often, and I'll go back one slide to mention this again, that you have sometimes this sense that Wright has designed horizontally in such a way that there's almost a floating look to his designs. And I think Tony also captured that. You have 2 cylinders, one on each side, that have scalloped bottoms and recessed supports. And as you come away from the building, there is this sense that even though it's a kind of a big concrete structure, that there's a feeling of lightness there, suspension. This is also accomplished by these projecting eaves over the windows. Again, sort of hanging, and pendentive is a word that is used to describe them. And it's a wonderful feature, of course, serving the practical purpose of reducing glare inside the building as well. Now, you might remember Wright's lakeshore drive for automobiles. That in the 1990s was not what we wanted to do, but we did have a very big, and still do, a very big bicycling community in Madison. Of course, bicyclists were accustomed to riding along this lakeshore before the building existed. So here we see that Tony put together a concept for a bike path running around the perimeter of the building on the lakefront, and it works quite nicely. There's 2 lanes for bicycle traffic and 1 for everybody else, whether you're walking or fishing or whatever. And there's a lot of activity on this bike path all year round, and especially summer, as you might imagine. Here you get a different perspective. I just love this photo and had to include it, of looking from the rooftop down onto the bike path. Here we have a gentleman who was kind enough to sort of be a model for us in the bike elevator. So bicycling was going to really happen not only around this building, but kind of through it, in the sense that the bicyclists would not come into the building, but we provided a bike elevator, a freight size elevator, so that you could move sort of up the hill towards the Capitol without taking other streets to do so. You can get in this elevator and move up to a different street in Madison. Here's a great aerial view of our rooftop, again from the other direction, not from the lakefront, but from downtown. I do want to point out that we just simply did not have the money to build 3 fountains. And if you ask me, I might answer a question in advance, because people often ask, well, if I give you a check right now, could you make that happen? It turns out we can't. That in fact, the 2 cylinders here that are meant to emulate those fountain features are incorporate all kinds of mechanical equipment and chillers for air conditioners and things. We couldn't convert them, unfortunately, but we did want to get across that there was this trio of cylinders with 1 fountain, and we were able to pay for this fountain by virtue of a huge $500,000 donation from a patron, most generous. Her name is Pleasant Rowland, and she started the American Girl doll company, which you may have heard of. Just a couple of rooftop close-ups of detail here I'll share with you. These pieces do light from inside, and again, you do still have that science fiction, spacey look to the place when you go up there. It is a wonderful space that accommodates weddings and concerts and all kinds of events. Here's a little look, because, you know, it's kind of fun to visit other Wright buildings and hear about the leaky roofs. You're not going to get that at our place. We have quite a successful rooftop structure here that works for us, and what you see is a concrete slab that is sloped for drainage. It's got a water-resistant membrane torched upon it, and some 4-inch pedestals that are adjustable and then support these pavers that are kind of, you might say, kind of floating. They're not grouted together, but the result is that water, snow can fall through those pavers and then be washed off. It's most effective. No leaky roofs here. And finally, just a couple of slides that would show you events at Monona Terrace that are kind of creative and different. Here's one in our ballroom space. We do about 600 events a year. Of course, 2020 is a different story. We are able to host right now 10 people. We have a couple of small events that happen here and there on our calendar, but a normal year for us would be about 600. Here's a wedding set. Obviously, people can come in and add decor as they choose. Trucks inside the room, that's always fun. We've got a lane over on the right side here of the screen that allows truck passage through the space and out the other side. And about 100 of our 600 events are community events. It was very clear in the 1990s, as the discussion around Monona Terrace took place, that civic leaders knew that this could not be a building only for conventioneers, that in fact it needed to be a place where the community felt they had a place for gathering, to attend events. And so I'm one of a department of 3 that puts on tours, educational programs. Misty, who you heard from at the beginning of the program, does this event called Moon Over Monona Terrace. We partner with the Madison Astronomical Society. And they bring these wonderful giant telescopes to look at the stars and planets. And the moon, of course. And here in an event that no longer happens, but it's such a great image, kites on ice, giant kites that are flown over the lake in February. I thought this might be an interesting slide to include while we're all quarantined. A little less so now perhaps, but nonetheless, it shows Wright at his studio, at his workspace. We've all carved out our own workspaces on dining tables and so forth. But it's just a wonderful photograph of him in the last weeks of his life, taken by photographer Pedro Guerrero. It shows projects that are currently on his desk in 1959, and the Guggenheim model sits behind him. We know he didn't retire, he just kept going, and in fact, the last 10 years of his life were extremely productive. He was asked at Taliesin one day by an apprentice what he thought about Monona Terrace and how that was all going. And of course, at that time, it had slowed to a halt. And he said, you know, it's been a pleasure to work on, and I do think it will be built someday. Maybe 10 years from now is what he referenced, which of course wasn't quite the case. But he did have confidence that Madisonians would come to their senses and build this beautiful structure, and indeed we have. We were calling it in our marketing material Wright's final masterpiece. Back in the 90s, that might have been the case for the time, but as the building aged and in the years following, there have been several unbuilt Wright projects that have been built. And one case is a boathouse designed for Madison originally that was built in Buffalo, New York. In another case, a golf resort. So in fact, I like to close with this because it's just such a testament to Wright's genius that certainly modifications need to happen, but indeed, Wright's architecture still speaks to us. So I'd like to close with that and answer any questions you may have.
Okay.
I've asked Misty to take a look at whatever might have popped up in the feed, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I have a question from Stephen. It seems appropriate to address the Marion County Civic Center in San Rafael, California. What is there a connection between these two structures by Wright? And is there a connection between these two structures by Wright?
I have not read anything where Wright is articulating the connection, but clearly that project is the closest to us. In terms of the forms and the curvilinear design, as well as being a government building that houses all kinds of different functions. So it's absolutely appropriate for you to bring that up, Stephen. I just don't know about anything formally Wright would have said about his design approach with the two buildings or what he was thinking about as a connection between those. But I appreciate that you brought it up.
Anne Smiley says, thank you for your excellent tour, especially Heather. It's almost as good as being there again.
Thank you, Anne. I probably have a few Monona Terrace docents on this call. Glad you could join us.
Not sure if you know the answer to this one. Lori's question is, what's the expected lifetime of the rooftop membrane?
Oh, wow. You know, that is not a question I know the answer to. I never hear about it. Misty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard about it as being something scheduled for replacement.
No, I can't say that I have either.
But, you know, I should say, well, first I'll say this was recorded today. So if you're going to share it with a friend or, you know, you couldn't make all of it, you're probably not hearing this now then, but you know, you can always watch the recording. And secondly, you'll get an email a day later about this program. If I would ask you, Lori, like, use that as a prompt then to email me and I can get an answer for you and speak to our maintenance supervisor. Sorry, I don't know.
We have a question from Fred. Are you open for tours now?
No, thanks, Fred. We're closed for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. So we are allowing these small gatherings, which under our order here in Dane County is 10 or less currently, those events to take place. But beyond that, we're not open. And we have not discussed a reopening date yet. So stay tuned. You can use our website to check in with us every once in a while.
Okay, the next question is, let's see here. Jaman, was 4 million based on anything realistic, or was it just the city's desired spend?
Yeah, I think in their analysis of what the project should be, 4 million would be a proper allocation for it. Wright's the problem always was that Wright was adding functions that the city didn't necessarily want. So it was not only just that, you know, he was giving them the program, but with this hiked up price tag, it was that he was in fact incorporating more elements too, which drove his price up. So.
Okay, next we have a question from Bev. I had always heard that the reason that this didn't get built was for so long was because of the dislike for Wright in Madison, i.e. debts he left, his adultery, etc. Not true?
I certainly think his personal life did become a problem for people. I kind of skated that a little bit, I guess, when I think about what I said about his comments to Madison, which were often insults, right? But the truth was too that his lifestyle, no doubt, put some people off. And people had known that he'd been married 3 times, that he'd had a mistress, that he overspent, that he sometimes didn't pay his bills. So certainly that was one of the factors. I don't like to play it up as the only one because I think there were other things at play. For instance, competing visions for, do we put a building there? Does it stay a park, for instance? But yes, you're right, Bev, that was certainly part of the story.
Next question from Peter. Does Monona Terrace generate monies for Madison? Is it profitable?
Good question. So we measure our success by economic impact. In past years, again, I have to say with the exception of 2020, which is a new norm, but in past years, we have measured that to be in the range of $30 to $40 million that is spent locally on dining, hotels, restaurants, by people who are here at Monona Terrace. In answering a question about a specific operating budget, however, the city does get, Monona Terrace does get a city subsidy every year of about $3 million from the hotel room tax, and then generates on its own merits about 4.5 to 5 million. So we could say that the annual operating expense budget for Monona Terrace might be in the neighborhood of 8 million when you add together the city subsidy plus the revenues generated by the building. I hope that makes sense.
Let's see. From Jaman, is the facility self-funding at this point?
Hopefully I just answered that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we will, we carry on with benefiting from the hotel room tax contribution, which in 2020 is, again, not what we usually see in terms of a subsidy. We're gonna manage, carry on here through a tough year.
question from Bruce. What was Paul Soglin's role and what changed Metzner's change?
And what was Metzner's what?
Change?
Paul Soglin was very important in the story, that he was the mayor who came into office for a second time. Actually, his second term was in the late 80s, and had started conversations about building a convention center based on Wright's design, and then had put together their commission, talked to Tony Putnam about the feasibility. So he was extremely important. Would we be talking about the building without him? Perhaps not. Carol Metzner was passed that bill successfully that killed the project in '57. I was not at the grand opening ceremonies in '97, but apparently he attended, so maybe he warmed up to the building. He was still living when the building opened.
Linda asks, and I think you covered this, but how much did it wind up costing Monona Terrace?
The cost of the project was $67.1 million. So that was, of course, set as a city project and a budget not to be exceeded. I know Tony has said to me in the past that there were details of the building that they simply couldn't afford to do, as is probably the case in most projects, but they stuck to that budget.
Okay, another question. Was there any controversy about adapting his plans so dramatically after his death, or was everyone happy to at least build some aspect of Frank Lloyd Wright's original plan?
There was definitely controversy in the 1990s as the building was being discussed before referendum. One of the arguments from some segment of the citizenry was that, Wright wasn't around anymore. It really wasn't a Wright building. So it's kind of ironic that some people didn't want to build it because it was a Wright building in the 50s. And some people were unhappy it wasn't a Wright building in the 90s. But that was one argument. And then there was there were concerns about environmental impact, but really the contractors, Findorf, worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA, and they really did an outstanding job of making sure this was not going to be damaging at all to the lake. So there definitely were arguments in the 90s as well, just different ones.
Let's see here. Another question. Let's see. I would have thought Frank Lloyd Wright would have been displeased that nearly 50% didn't vote for him. Did they vote no, or was there some other architect in the running?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I can see that I can see the logic behind your comment there. There was not another architect in the running. So it was either a yes, no vote. Would he have wanted more? Maybe, but he took the 52%, and he probably, tried to dismiss the rest of it. They didn't know what they were talking about.
Okay. I know you answered this one, but was Taliesin Architects involved in the project at all?
Yes, so Taliesin Architects no longer exists as a firm, but certainly they did in the 1990s, and they were, Tony was a member of Taliesin Architects, and other members of that firm were also involved in the project.
We have a question. Would you speak to the natural plantings that have evolved around the terrace?
Oh, that's probably somebody local who has.
That's one of our docents.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't have a lot of detail about specifically what is planted on a rooftop, but I will say that the original landscaping plan was more of more annuals, more formal plantings like you might see at the Capitol or other very orderly rows of planted annuals, I'll just say that. We have since gone to a different, we don't hire a contract out our landscaping. We've hired a gardener who's got a lot of experience and has successfully converted many of those beds now to prairie plantings that definitely are wilder in their appearance. And Misty can tell you sometimes they're so tall people can't quite see over them to the band performing at the concert. But our gardener, who also happens to be named Tony, has done a wonderful job with those plantings. I think they are more in keeping somehow with the spirit of our building. And I will also add, we recently had to remove some trees due to blight, and they have been replaced by new young redbud trees. So if you were to visit there, and I should mention, our rooftop garden is open. You can go and hang out at the garden. You just can't go indoors, but there's you will see the new redbud trees, which hopefully in the future will give us a lot of shade because it's real hot up there.
We have a question from Glenn. How does the footprint of 1,000 feet by 400 feet compare with what was eventually built?
What we know about Putnam's design and plan was that it incorporated over 100,000 additional square feet based on what they perceived to be the needs of the convention center. So it's the math, I'm afraid, I can't speak to really any more than that. We know Tony would not have been projecting quite so far out into the lake. So probably the space we're talking about that's additional would have been on land. But that's maybe the best I can answer that question. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. Let's see. I had a couple of people ask where they can find a copy of this presentation and the previous presentation.
Yes. So what we'll do is it usually takes about a day or two to get this up, but we'll put this up on our website. So what you should do when you go to mononaterrace.com is go to the Wright Design Series page, which is on community events. And there you'll see the recordings. Unfortunately, Kim, our previous speaker, asked for her presentation not to be recorded, so you won't find that there. You will find Mark Hertzberg's presentation from May.
Let's see. Lori asks, is the parking ramp open right now as well? Yes, the parking ramp is open. And then another one of our docents asked, the ramp to the rooftop has ginkgo trees, which complement the carpet design, correct?
That is true. Thank you for adding that.
A lot of people are just saying, complimenting the presentation.
Thank you. Glad to have you all with us today.
We had a couple from Oslo, Norway. Oh,
great. Yes, they have reached out before. Thanks for joining us from Norway. We're officially an international program.
One of the first questions we got right away was someone who also graduated from George Washington University with the same master's, but in French teaching.
Oh, wow.
That's and then cool. Stated, we are a rare breed.
Awesome.
Let's see if I have any actual questions or just a lot of well done. Thank yous.
Thank you.
Oh, question from Peter. What's next for the Frank Lloyd Wright presentations?
Oh, that's a wait and see, meaning I'm still going through speaker invitations. So I have no answer to that yet, but stay tuned. If you are not receiving notifications of this program by email, I would also use that automated email that will go out in about a day about this program to respond to me. and let me know that you'd like to be added to our email list. But my guess is that you might already be on it, but just so you know.
Another international, we have someone joining us from South Africa.
Woo! Awesome.
Let's see if we have any that I missed that talk about, ask a specific question.
We like to cover all the questions if we can.
This one mentions the controversy you already spoke about. Let's see, but then ask what were the concerns and then why did they finally decide to approve it? This
Well,
the controversies, I'm sorry, to put it in context, the controversies from the 80s and 90s.
Well, I would say that there was generally much more, I think just much more support, that some of the bodies of people who were against Monona Terrace were more outliers in many respects. I think that a convention center, that the mayor and the commission, the Monona Terrace Commission, were interested in promoting the economic stimulus of the building. So that garnered support from the business community. And at the same time, they were building strong support among community members. And I just have to say, I think that some key players, and we don't have time to name them all, were just instrumental in really moving it forward. So though I mentioned arguments against Wright, against Monona Terrace in the 90s, I would say those were the voices of fewer than before. So there's always the fact that this building, this is a critical point that I should have mentioned, and that is that originally construction costs coming from the city were tapping the general fund. So though we no longer tap the general fund property tax dollars for Monona Terrace, initial construction costs did tap that. So naturally that is always a deal breaker for people. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciated the opportunity to share the building with you, given that we don't know when we can do that, hopefully soon, but we just don't know. So we do hope that you'll take the opportunity next time you're in our neighborhood to come in and visit us. For those of you who really are thinking about a trip to Wisconsin in the future, there is something called the Frank Lloyd Wright Trail. Searchable online, and it connects 9 Frank Lloyd Wright designs, public designs, across southern Wisconsin. So it provides a nice portal for familiarizing yourself with all those properties. So we hope to see you in the future, and thank you very much. Bye, everybody.